Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into the Bible, but maybe not in the way you'd expect. We're not using theology, we're using archaeology. We're going to see how some ancient Babylonian texts can completely flip the script on stories you thought you knew inside and out.
All right, let's just jump right in with a pretty provocative question. What if the real key to understanding the Bible isn't just in the words themselves, but buried deep in the sands of what we now call Iraq? What if we have to put these stories back into their original world to really get them? So, we're not talking about all of history, of course. We're zooming in on a very specific time, the Old Babylonian period. Now, this is right around the time of the biblical patriarchs. Think Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it turns out this era is an absolute gold mine for context. And where are we getting all this juicy information? Well, a lot of it comes from the ancient city of Mari. Archaeologists there uncovered an absolute treasure trove, over 20,000 clay tablets written in cuneiform. I mean, think about that. It's like finding a complete library from almost 4,000 years ago, giving us this direct, totally unfiltered look into their world, their laws, you name it. Okay, so let's get into our first case study to see how this actually works in practice. We're going to start small, with just a single word, but it's a big one, a powerful one, and a word you are absolutely certain you know the meaning of. Or do you?
Yeah, what does it mean to love God? Sounds simple, right? It's a feeling, an emotion. But what if I told you that back then, the answer had way less to do with your heart and a whole lot more to do with, well, politics and power? Check this out. This is a real quote from one of those tablets from Mari. It's a letter from a queen, Queen Shiptu, to her general. And she says, "If you truly love me, you will do such and such." Now get this. This is not a love letter. Not even close. It's a command. She's not asking for his warm, fuzzy feelings. She's demanding his absolute, unwavering loyalty. And right there, that's the whole key. It perfectly shows how the meaning has shifted over time. For us, love is an emotion, affection, a feeling. But in this ancient political treaty-making world, love was an action. It was proof of loyalty. It was all about obedience. So there was actually a formal name for this kind of political arrangement. Historians call it a suzerainty covenant. It's basically a treaty between a big, powerful ruler and a smaller, subordinate one. And to make it official, they'd use family language. The big king was the father, and the vassal king was the son. But make no mistake, this was all legal jargon, not a family reunion. Okay, so here's where it all clicks into place. When you read in the Bible in Deuteronomy, "You shall love the Lord your God," it's using that exact same political treaty language. It's not a command to feel something warm and fuzzy. It's a legal command to do something. It's saying, you must be loyal, you must be obedient, you must keep your side of this covenant with everything you've got. All right, so that was one word. Now let's scale up. Let's move from a single word to a whole epic story. Probably one of the most famous stories ever told, the Great Flood. So if you put the much older Babylonian story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, side by side with the story of Noah in Genesis, wow, the parallels are just impossible to ignore. I mean, both have a divine plan to flood the world, a hero who gets a warning to build a massive boat, the boat landing on a mountain, even sending out birds to find dry land. The overlap is just undeniable. But here's the thing. The most interesting stuff isn't in the similarities. It's in the differences. That's where the real meaning is hiding. Let's just start with the why. Why did the flood happen in the first place? Well, in the Gilgamesh story, it's almost comical. The humans were just making too much noise, and the gods couldn't get any sleep. But in Genesis, it's a deeply moral reason. Humanity had become corrupt. And what about the gods themselves? Again, totally different worlds. The Babylonian gods are, well, they're a mess. They're squabbling, they're tricking each other, they're secretive. The hero only gets saved because one god whispers the plan to him behind the other's backs. Compare that to Genesis, where you have one God who is presented as just and who speaks directly and clearly to Noah. Even the boat itself is telling a different story. In the Gilgamesh epic, the hero is told to build a perfect cube, a giant box. I mean, you don't have to be a naval architect to know that thing is not going to float well. It's basically a joke. But Noah, he's given specific seaworthy dimensions, a long rectangular vessel that's actually designed to survive a flood. And then the ending. What happens after the water goes down? In Gilgamesh, the gods are kind of relieved it's over. but they make zero promises for the future. It could all happen again. But in Genesis, the story ends with something huge, a covenant, a binding promise from God sealed with a rainbow that he will never again destroy the world with a flood.
So, what are we supposed to make of all this? We have these similar story beats, but wildly different meanings. The real takeaway here isn't just, oh, the stories are similar. No, the most important stuff is found when we ask why they're so different. There's a great quote from a scholar, Dr. Donald Fowler, who says we shouldn't get tripped up or bothered by the similarities. The real work, the important part, is being able to explain both the similarities and the differences. Because it's in that contrast, in that tension, that the author's real message pops.
So here's the bottom line. The biblical authors weren't just copying and pasting. They weren't plagiarists. Think of it more like they were joining a huge, ongoing cultural conversation. They took a story everyone knew, a popular trope of their time, and they used that familiar frame to make a radical new point, to argue for a completely different vision of what God is like and what humanity is all about.
And that leaves us with one last question to chew on. Does discovering all this ancient context, this backstory, somehow diminish the Bible? Or does it do the opposite? Does it actually reveal that its authors were making a point that was way more radical, way more countercultural, and way more profound than we ever imagined?